My typical working palette for portraits consists of titanium white, cadmium yellow, yellow ochre, raw umber, cadmium orange, burnt sienna, burnt umber, alizarin crimson, viridian, and ivory black. I organize these colors on my palette by color family and then by value. This gives me a pretty decent range of mixable colors, particularly those colors that correspond most to human flesh, which is usually some variant of orange. If we graph these colors on a slice of the Munsell color model, we can see a range of potential admixtures that lean pretty heavily on the yellow to red side of the wheel. This bias towards orange is what will help me paint the nuances I see in skin color. A portrait study is essentially, for me, an alla prima painting, or a painting done in one sitting without multiple layers. Because of the time constraints, I draw directly on the canvas with my brush, using a dry but thin application of raw umber paint. I like to use older, disheveled brushes for these initial marks, as they help me keep the line quality somewhat rough and vague and prevent me from fixating too much on detail. From the outside head shape, I move to the mask of the face that is distinguished by the hairline before I start plotting the locations of the features. The features are defined by regions of darker value or shadow that have some relationship to the outside shape of the face. I use straight lines for much of the drawing so I can more plainly see the angular relationships. I mask in the dark values of the hair and shadow regions to help me assess proportions and judge whether or not I'm getting a good likeness. Because oil paint takes a while to dry, drawing with a paintbrush means the drawing is somewhat fluid and malleable throughout much of the process, so I try to keep things simple and clean so that it'll be easier for me to add strokes of color on top of later. At the latter stages of the drawing, I switch out my workhorse block-in brush for a newer, a little bit more organized, pointed filbert to get some of the detail areas around the mouth, nose, and eyes. The softer, scrubbier appearance of the drawing underneath is a good basis for adding detail, very much like when you're drawing with a sharp pencil over softly erased lines. Once I'm satisfied with the drawing, I begin the process of adding tiles of paint color. I like to start where I feel like I can get a good purchase on the form, or where I can really feel the fullness of what I'm seeing. The model's apple cheeks and bridge of the nose seem like a good place to start for their apparent roundness and direct orientation to the light. I begin from where the light seemed to be hitting most directly and mix color for that region before placing the halftones that define the side and down planes of these forms. I apply the color in a patchwork of strokes. I do this intentionally so that I can keep a better sense of the form structure by being very obvious about where the surface is changing direction. I think the tendency to blend between strokes too much can have an undesirable effect of diluting both the form and the color. With the darker halftone values in place, I can more confidently build my value structure by optically comparing how dark I should go in an area to something lighter or darker. I also try to think about the complicated structures of the portrait more simplistically. The once separate and distinct features of the cheeks that I began with are now more obviously a part of the larger form of the mouth and jaw. To identify the color, I use the Munsell model to help me determine the hue, value, and chroma of each individual paint stroke. The hue I tend to think of in terms of temperature shifts or relative comparison to other analogous colors. So if I know I'm starting essentially at orange for flesh color, I try to assess whether or not that color is leaning more red or leaning more yellow. We see these shifts often on the portrait in areas where the skin is either more exposed to sun or is thinner and more transparent. But many of the color changes we'll see on the portrait are not necessarily changes in the local color or pigmentation of the skin, but have to do with the fact that certain surfaces receive less light. This means that in most instances, the local color as it turns into shadow will have both darker value and a weaker chroma or intensity than those areas more directly facing the light. We see this change in the down planes of the cheeks and jaw, where the color seems to shift almost gray because there's less light to reflect the color information back to our eyes.
We can dramatically see how surface angle affects color if we compare the tones of the upper lip to the bottom lip. The upper lip tends to angle more downward as opposed to the bottom lip, which tends to angle up. Because of this difference in angle, we see the lower lip catching relatively more light and having more brilliant color than the upper lip that is largely in shadow.
I begin the eyes with the darkest notes of the pupil, iris, and fold of the upper lid. The presence of eyeshadow turns the color more violet here as it makes its way up to the light. I tend to pay careful attention to the transition from the crease above the upper eyelid to the brow ridge, which helps to anchor the eyes into the bony structures of the brow. The lower lids also help fix the eye in place, and I tend to paint both eyes at the same time to make sure I'm keeping their relationship somewhat symmetrical. I like to move pretty systematically around the forms of the portrait. That is to say, I tend to build from one structure to the next to help me attain a tactile sense of the surface in 2 dimensions on my canvas. The angle and shape of the brushstrokes also help with encouraging this form sense. Since I consider this a study, I try to prioritize economy of the brushstrokes, or trying to express the most information with the least amount of individual strokes of paint color. I quickly block in the hair with a mixture of burnt umber and black. Hair is easiest to conceptualize if you think of it in masses or large groupings of hair shapes, rather than trying to paint individual strands of hair. With the darker values of the hair framing the portrait and adding context, I revisit the features, adding some additional transitional tones to better describe the form. My palette in this process tends to start to resemble some of the gradations of tone I'm painting in the portrait, as I like to adjust each pool of paint based on another adjacent pool on my palette before it ever reaches the canvas. Hue, value, and chroma exist on a relative spectrum, which means the only way you'll figure out what color to mix is by a visual comparison to other colors. But to create the illusion of 3-dimensional form, we can't rely just on matching and contrasting color. We have to develop a form sense also and be able to understand how these changes in color translate to changes in surface orientation to the light. This is a wonderful exercise for any artist trying to distill the essential characteristics of his or her subject. For me, that essential character is revealed by how light cuts form, since all of the detail has to be subordinate to this effect. Thank you for watching this video. I hope to post more content soon.